a warm, heartfelt, touching story from my personal life. That is pure sarcasm. Let me tell you. So when I'm in my 20s, and I'm over at my in-laws' house one weekend. They lived close, and my kids were young and liked to play over there. So we were over there quite a bit. And my wife's stepfather's parents, so grandma and grandpa, were there that weekend visiting from out of town. And I walk into a room on a Saturday, flick the light on, and I jump because grandma's sitting there in a chair in the dark. And I was like, oh, did you want the light off? She says, no, that's fine. It's fine. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I mean, is it okay on? I mean, she's like, no, you're fine. You're fine. I was like, what in the world is going on? I had no idea. Well, I found out she was Seventh-day Adventist. And Seventh-day Adventists believe that you keep the Sabbath holy by not doing any work on Saturday. I believe I'm getting that right. Forgive me if you're Seventh-day Adventist, and I'm not. I was like, okay, my gosh, have I been doing this wrong? Because I go to church on Sunday typically. On Saturday it's like sports and playing and hobbies, right? Am I not keeping the Sabbath holy? Am I breaking one of the 10 commandments? And I was like, do we even live under the Old Testament law? Well, no, we don't. But the 10, what is this whole Sabbath thing? Do I have it wrong? What does God really want? Well, we're going to talk about some of the principles behind that. And so I have a wonderful guest with me today. I'll show you a book that's been out a little while. It's called Soul Rest, and it's by Curtis Zackery. And he has a new devotional out based on this, and it is a wonderful, I think, idea and topic to address in a group. So you can find Soul Rest the book, and you can find Soul Rest the devotional out now. But Curtis Zackery is a teaching pastor at Church of the City in beautiful Franklin, Tennessee. I love that area. And he's going to help us understand what God intends with this whole idea of Sabbath. So jump in here and be a part of the conversation if you'd like. And Curtis, it's great to have you. I appreciate you being on Life Today Live.
Man, super excited to have the conversation with you, for sure.
So maybe we should, before we get into some of the principles you lay out, which I think are very helpful and very important, let's talk just a little bit on a theological point about the Sabbath. Do I have it wrong by going to church on most Sundays? And is that holy enough?
I think one of the most important things that we can do when it comes to any sort of desire to understand God's intention when it comes to any of the 10 commandments is to really establish our perspective of what that list of things is. I think many of us look at the 10 commandments as a list of 10 rules or laws to follow so that God will be pleased with you.
Yep.
I would take a different tact to that and say, rather than it just simply being a list of rules and laws, it's really 10 pathways toward communion with God. It's his intention for us in his godness and his desire for us to experience connectedness to him, that he gives us the gift of what the 10 commandments represent. It's these 10 ideas that show us where the barriers to intimacy with him lie. And he gives us 10 ways to be able to connect with him well. And so with that, it definitely for me shifts this idea of the important thing being the rightness and wrongness of my keeping the Sabbath to starting it with, do I understand God's intention for me when it even comes to his desire for me to experience Sabbath? It wasn't this rigorous test for me to follow to show how much I love him or to show how pleasurable I am to him. It's actually his desire that I would experience Sabbath and receive the gift of what it represents. So in that way, I think I have to give that preface because it's not an immediate, for me, move to answering the rightness and wrongness before I would say we take a more broad look at God's intention for humanity with it.
I agree with you. And I think a lot of times we get a misconception that God is a rule maker when really he is someone who wants relationship with us. It's you go all the way back to the garden with Adam and Eve, and it's the restoration of that walking with him and fellowshipping with him. Just, I know this is going to come up, so let's hit it right now, and then we'll move on. Do we follow the Ten Commandments as law in the new covenant?
Yeah, I think it's obviously, like you said, everyone's thought is immediately correlated with, if you tell me the right thing to do and the wrong things that I shouldn't do, that gives me some rails to travel on. It gives me some guidance. It gives me some direction as it pertains to how to live a life that is pleasurable to him. And so I don't believe that the Ten Commandments are any less law. They are law, but I believe that when it says Jesus came to fulfill the law, he came to embody and to fully, comprehensively take on the realm of the governance of what that law represents for us on a day-to-day basis. So with that being said, when God looks at me, he no longer sees me in my sin. He sees the finished work of Jesus when I accept Christ, what it says in Romans that chapter 10, that I confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in my heart that God raised him from the dead, I'll be saved. I am saved not because of my work, like it says in Ephesians 2:8-9. It's by grace I've been saved through faith, not from work, so that no one can brag about it. So I have salvation through the embodiment of Jesus coming and dying and taking on the penalty for my life, sin. That being said, those 10 commandments from the very beginning, even though they were the governance of the law, they were still, again, mostly intended for me to understand what it means to have the fullness of relationship with him. So those 10 commandments for me are still imposed upon my life. They still are the way that I am supposed to live. And yet my salvation's not found or discovered or held by my keeping of them. It's Christ alone. So the answer is yes and no.
Yeah, that's a good Irish answer. Everything's always yes and no. Uh, I tell you what, you want to light up the chat. You just started a discussion about law versus grace, and we've done that. Let's move on. So in soul rest, you're getting into the heart of the purpose, the heart of God behind that law. Give us a little bit of an overview, and then I want to ask you in a little bit why you even went down this path. But give us an overview of the ideas in soul rest.
Yeah, so I think for me, and we'll talk, like you said, about my own personal journey into this, but where I arrived was this awareness that in the very beginning of this whole story in the creation, that God had made everything and he made it beautifully. When it came to humanity, one of the most important distinctions that I found was that God didn't first make human beings to do for him. He actually first made human beings to be with him. And that, really, as simple as it may sound, has changed so much about my understanding of who God is and what that means for me. Because I do believe that God made us to do for him, to work for him, to live for him. But every bit of that for him comes from him. It flows from a relationship with him. And so what I recognized was God's intention for humanity from the very beginning was for us to be with him first. That has never changed, even right now in 2021. He doesn't all of a sudden now care most about what our work is for him, then worry about our relationship with him. No, that's never changed. Now, what we recognize is back in Genesis chapter 3, very soon after the creation of humanity, greatest problem in all the Bible, sin, which has disrupted the rhythm of connection between the God of the universe and the creation whom he made. Now we are left longing soulishly to be satisfied by the only one who made us with one soul satisfaction, himself. And we have turned to other things in our humanity to try to find satisfaction for a soulish longing that is not eternal. So one of the things that the Sabbath provides for us is this beautiful reminder of what God has already displayed. So in Genesis chapter 2, I'll try to do this very quickly. So in Genesis chapter 2,
Take your time, please. That's what we're here for, to hear the details.
so in Genesis 2, verses 2 through 3, three times in two verses, it says something very interesting, that on the seventh day of creation, God rested from the work that he had done. And it says that exact phrase three times. He rested from the work that he had done. Now, there are a couple questions that come to mind for me. And the very first one, to be honest, is why would God rest at all?
Sure. Yeah. Right.
Keep reading the Bible and you realize he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent. So he knows everything, he has all power, and he's everywhere. So he's not going to get physically tired. What value would it hold for God to three times in two verses make sure that we know that he rested from the work that he had done? Now, if you read the Bible at any length, it's important for us to realize repeated statements are definitely places to pay attention to, especially when they're so truncated. I mean, so close in proximity. And so that put me down a path. Why was he pressing this idea of his resting from his work? Well, in Exodus 37, there's a verse and it says that God rested and he was refreshed. So it's interesting because not only did he find significance in his rest, but it says that he got something from it that was so refreshing that it could be refreshing to God himself. Now, what could be so refreshing that it could refresh God? Why would God need refreshment, and what could provide this? Well, what we realize is found in that phrase being repeated three times in two verses. It's the work that he had done. It's the work that could only be done by his hand alone. So when God rested, he looked back at what he had made by his hand and he said, it is good. It is enough. It is finished. I am satisfied. And so what he was doing on that seventh day was finding refreshment, a celebration in the work that could only be done by the hand of God. So when we fast forward and we see in Exodus 28, in this list that we've been talking about, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor, and on the seventh day you should do no work. No one in your house, your maidservant, nobody does work. So he says, on the seventh day, you need to keep that day holy. You need to honor the Sabbath. Well, what would make the day holy? Now, you referenced earlier in your own personal story, there are different ways and representations in our current day that we practice or honor the Sabbath. And I understand that there are different representations around what that looks like from a denominational standpoint, what that looks like from a theological standpoint. I think where I've landed in my own discovery was this place where he says to keep the Sabbath holy. For me, that's an allusion to, well, how did God himself keep the Sabbath holy? How did he practice this? Well, what it says is he rested from the work that he had done and he found refreshment in his finished work. So what he was calling us to do when he gets to the humanities instruction to do this is to remember the work that can be done by his hand alone. So 6 days, we work. In those 6 days, we accomplish, we move, we go, we build, we do, we acquire. But on the seventh day, we remember that there is a work that can only be done by God's hand alone. When we remember that work, we keep the Sabbath holy. So what we do as human beings, and we have a tendency to do this in not just the Sabbath, but in many different areas, we take something that is intended for God and make it all about ourselves. We just have a knack of doing that. And so what ended up happening, as we know things unfolded over years and time, was there was this rule, as we call it, from the Ten Commandments. I would say this pathway that God has given us to commune with him. And we started saying, okay, well, this is a pathway or a rule to connect with God. But for us to determine who is the most spiritual, the most religious, the most able to keep these rules, we need to add some more rules so that the original rule will not get tainted. And so That sounds, when we say it that way, very counterintuitive. But when you think about it, we do it all the time. I mean, even to our expectations around how we gather at church on Sunday. We have certain expectations for how people should enter into what we articulate as so simple when it comes to knowing the love of God. And we do it because we in our humanity love to be able to have the boundaries, those rails, those things so we can govern who's good, who's bad, who's in, who's out. And so when I get back to this whole idea of resting in the work that comes from God, I think that was his intention for the Sabbath, that we would receive the refreshment of knowing there is a work that we can do with our hand. We stop to remember the work that only he can do by his hand alone. And just to finish that idea, I told you I was going to try to go fast.
No, that's great.
That this applies to me today in my life is I fast forward to the New Testament. Jesus, bloody, beaten on the cross for sins that he didn't commit. And he is on this cross to reconcile us, sinful human beings, to a holy and righteous God. This is a work that no human being could ever do. The work that could only be done by the hand of God alone. But Jesus, right before he dies, takes a breath and says, "It is finished." What is finished? It's the same type of work that we remember on the Sabbath. God rested from the work that he had done. It's a work that could be done by his hand alone. And so when we rest, understanding that the finished work on the cross brings us life, brings us goodness, brings us wholeness, brings us reconciliation. It's a work that can be done by his hand alone. And our rest is a soulish one. In Matthew 11, you remember he was talking to a group of people who had been working hard to keep all these rules and laws, and they had become exhausted because they could never do it. You also have all this group of people who are administering all the rules and laws and judging what's going on. And Jesus has the audacity to stand in front of them. In Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke," which means my teaching, "and to learn from me. I'm gentle and lowly in heart." And then he says the words, "You will find rest for your souls." And so for me, that's what the Sabbath holds in regard to its significance. To me personally, it's not about the rightness and wrongness at the surface. It's not about a rule to be followed. It's about a provided pathway of communion with God that he gave to humanity way back at the beginning of the story. And it's still available to us as a pathway of communion with him now.
Okay. I'm digesting that. And one question comes to mind immediately, which is if it's to remember what only God can do in our lives, shouldn't we do that every day?
Yeah, we absolutely should. And
So what makes one day of the week different on that order?
yeah, so our life is to, when they ask Jesus, "It's the greatest commandment," what does he say? "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength. Love your neighbor as yourself is equal to this." Do we do that on a daily basis? No, because it says in Galatians chapter 5 that our flesh is against the spirit is against the flesh, keep them from doing what they want to do. So even Christian people sin. I don't know if we needed to hear that today, if you needed the Bible to remind you of that, but even Christian people sin because our humanity, our flesh rises up, and we, even as Christian people, can be subject to making decisions based upon what our flesh or our desires want to do. Understanding that to be true, that God's desire for us is to be fully immersed in our love with all of our heart for him and for our neighbor, but recognizing that on a regular basis, there will be tension. This day set aside for us to keep the Sabbath is an intentional move for us to lay down the things that will be potential barriers to intimacy with God. Knew from the very beginning, in this rhythmic sense, that humans would need this reminder, this Little reminder to come back to the place where we go, it's not about you, it's all about him. Again, I never would ever presume to allude to an idea that there shouldn't be work in our lives. God made us. It says in Ephesians 2:10, for good works which he has set beforehand. The problem is we can tend, if we're not careful, to, even in the name of God, begin to do work for God, but forget to do that work with God. What this does for us is bring calibration. I go back to what you said you walked in on when you saw that your grandma was there in the room with no lights on, and just our attempt in our humanity to be so still, to make sure there is nothing I will do on that day to steal from the reality that I'm trying with my best effort to honor that God is working while I am resting. That looks different for different people. But what I want you to know is that one day is this gift from God to say, you will have to work. You will have to tend the land. You will have to produce. But you need to regularly come back to the fact that you are not the great producer. You are not the great provision. That's why that one day is important.
Yeah, I like it. And we're talking to Curtis Zackery. This is his book, Soul Rest. And he has a devotional out around soul rest. You can pick those up. I'll show you his website. It is right here. It's called findrest.org. Findrest.org. I'll throw that in the chat. And I'm curious, what do you think, Curtis, happens to us when we don't set apart one day to have our souls rest and replenish? What happens to us when we just overlook that?
Yeah, so I think, the one day aspect, again, is going to become a point of awareness or contention for many of us. What day is it? What does the day look like? How do we order and structure all of that? Again, before I get to that piece in my own pursuit, the most important question really does lie with what you're saying. What is God's intention for me as a result of experiencing this type of rest at all? And I think what I receive from this rest is a full picture of the appropriate understanding of my identity. My identity, my worth, and my value are not contingent upon what I produce into the world. They're contingent upon whose I am and who I am in Christ. And so when we don't practice regular rhythms of stopping and consideration of the work that can only be done by the hand of God alone, our identity, our worth, and our value become contingent upon what we make out into the world. And what that leads toward is any myriad or any number of different representations. That can look like me being filled with anxiety, stress, and worry, that unless I do something significant into the world, unless I show myself to be spiritual or a representation of God, unless I produce certain things, what that might look like is my sense of value to God is less if I'm not creating or producing, which then manifests itself in any number of ways. So I think, that's scratching the surface, but a simple point, I would just say when we don't consider that all of who we are and the work that we do comes from God first, we can make it about ourselves. And when we make it about ourselves as the sole and contingent part of how we sustain in our lives, we are not built to be able to do that. So that will lead to us falling and failing in our flesh.
Yeah, and we see this. We see Christians just burn out. People that are working for God just flat out burn out because they don't take the time. Now you've got some skin in this game. This is not just theology to you. Tell us quickly this sort of what got you in a position where you needed to find soul rest for yourself, and how that discovery has really helped you.
Yeah, I think the quickest way to say it is my wife and I moved to the Bay Area in California, and we had joined a beautiful work there. It was a small church plant in an area called Richmond, and we were just outside of San Francisco. We had a ton of friends who were homeless friends, people who were in recovery from addiction, people who were transitioning out of prison. We had a lot of friends dealing with some very intense things. And so the type of work that we were doing was very fulfilling. It was what we knew to be good work for God. But one of the things that I quickly started to realize within about a year there was I wasn't exactly sure that I could continue to sustain in the type of work that I was doing, because I'd realized how much of my own willpower, how much of my own energy and effort went into trying to engage in what felt like, quite honestly, some very irresolvable situations. Like homelessness was a very real and present issue where we lived, and high crime and people dealing with addictions. It was just very difficult. And so one of the things that I realized was I knew I was doing work for God. And as I referenced earlier, I'm just not sure I was doing that work with God. And this was an honest assessment. This took for me to just see, my giftedness or my ability to talk about the Bible or my desire to serve God wasn't enough to sustain me. There had to be more. I think the second thing that I realized during that season, when that was kind of a reckoning, was my wife and I were hopeful to have children, and we experienced loss through miscarriage a couple of times. And the second time, it's further along. We had to go to the emergency room at 2 a.m. It was just an awful, awful process. And so that level of pain and grief, coupled with recognizing I was starting to become tired in my work for God, started to bring more questions to the surface, saying, what am I really even doing? I don't know why this is happening. I feel like I'm giving everything that I have for God, but I don't know that I can keep it up. And then the third piece of that was, even though we had people around us, and even though we had good friends and people who cared about us greatly, we personally just felt alone in our plight, because we felt like we're the only ones that are experiencing some of this. And we didn't really know how to talk about it. And in the times when I would find a little window to be able to share some of it, I would have people say back to me, well, you're the guy that we would normally talk to if we're in trouble. So we don't know what to do or what to say. So they would just kind of say, we'll give you space. And so for me, it was those three things converging together that helped me to realize this is not sustainable. There's no way I can continue to live this way. And to be honest, what I've realized is, sadly, if it were just one of those things, I probably would have just put my head down and kept going. Just, man, it's not, not for me to be happy. I just got to figure it out. And, but those three things together ended up realizing this can't be the way that God intended for it to be. And for me, the summarization of it comes down to two thoughts. One was, I read a quote from a guy named Soren Kierkegaard, and he said, it is absolutely unethical when one becomes so busy communicating that he forgets to be what he teaches. And so that was like the real awareness. Something needs to change, because it wasn't a proactive hypocrisy. It was just, I've arrived at this place where I could talk about God all day. I just wasn't experiencing him myself. And then the second thought, and this is really what set me into the work that you're talking about, I felt like God was saying, if I took away everything that you do for me, all of the stuff, not just in front of people, all your volunteerism, all the work, all the effort that you're putting into things out into the world, if I took all that away, would you still love and worship me with the same passion? Like, if you couldn't do all the stuff you were doing, am I enough for you? And I felt like, sadly and very quickly, I realized my answer was no. And the distinction there was not him saying, do you love me? Because I would have said yes. But what he was saying is it the same for you if there's not a bunch of stuff? Is me and you, is that enough? And I realized the answer was no, but that's what I wanted to be true. So that's how I got to it.
Yeah, I know. That's good. I think most of us get to a point where we realize the way I'm doing it's not working. And again, I like your phrase, proactive hypocrisy, because it's not something we set out to do. We don't set out to say, you know what, I'm going to go on a path to burnout, or I'm going to try to do things under my own power, and then I'll credit God later for it. It's like no, we're human, and the beautiful thing is God understands that. He's just waiting for us to come enter into his rest, and it's a lot easier than we make it. So last question, I'm just curious, how, do you have any particular ways that work for you in finding that soul rest
Yeah.
on a regular, rhythmical, if that's a word, rhythmic basis?
Yeah.
In other words, what does your Sabbath look like?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to approach that would be, again, rather than too quickly focusing on the how, kind of going back to the why. And so there's three words for me that I've allowed to become essentially the governance of what I want to approach Sabbath with. And it's number one, intentional. I need to show up to this thing. I need to say to God with open hands, I am here for you to give me the rest that only you can give me.
Yeah.
May seem pretty obvious, but I think it still needs to be said. Some of us, like you just said, might assume that it comes naturally as a result of just living our lives. But again, without a malicious intent, we develop these rhythms where we make it about ourselves or we do in our own strength. But intentionality says, I'm showing up to make space to receive the rest from you.
I like
And
it.
the reason I say we don't jump to the how too quickly is now for me, I do hold a 24-hour period where we try to make that happen. But it may start for some of us, say for 10 minutes. I need you, God. I'm going to put aside my phone, and put aside a book. I'm going to put aside everything and just try to make space to receive what only you can do. The second one, and this was a big one for me, was that it needs to be a substantial investment. So the first one is an intentional investment. I'm going to show up. The second one, and this is really harder for us than we realize, is to believe once we show up that we will actually meet with God there. I mean, how many times have we made a commitment with intentionality to say, I'm going to read the Bible every day for 30 days in a row. I'm going to go for a prayer walk every day. And sadly, in my life, too often I have made those commitments. And the only thing that I got out of it was the ability to be able to say, well, I did that for 30 days.
Right.
And the real question is what I have done a pathway to connection with God? So what I want to do is have intentionality, say I want to show up to meet with him. Then I want to say, I want to believe that God can give me the thing that I need. It will be a substantial connection. And then the third one is sustainable. I feel like that's another helpful way to go back to the thought that you asked about earlier. You said, why is there this one day a week thing that God is elevating? What's the importance of this one day? Well, it's a sustainable rhythm. It's a cyclical idea to say every 7 days we're coming back to, are we good? Are you the provider or am I the provider? Am I enough for you or do you look for other things? Okay, no? Good. Work on that for a week and then we'll come back in 7 days. We'll talk about it again. And I think that's what's true for us here is, those three things. What are the ways that I can build into my life an intentional showing up to a substantial connection with God in a way that is sustainable? So for me, very quickly, we take from Friday evening to Saturday evening, a Sabbath day. And that looks like for us, regular intentional remembrance of who God is and what that means for our lives. I don't hold to a position that the more inactive I am, the more spiritual. I don't hold to that simply because I think what makes the day holy is my intentional remembering of the work that he had done. Now, I do hold to the fact that I want to put aside the work that I do with my hands causes me to produce, to make. And I do think it's important and there's a value to that. But I don't think my ability to do that better makes the Sabbath more rich for me.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's actually an important point. Is literally Pastor Robert Morris, Gateway Church, has a book called "Take the Day Off," and he basically says it's just a day where you don't do any work. So whatever it is you do for work to provide for your means, you just don't do that because we need that time of stepping away from that, and it's God's gift, not just in the practical aspect of, hey, you get a day off, but it's God's gift of saying, now come commune with me, Beautiful. Am I missing anything? Before I let you go, I appreciate your time. I appreciate this message. It's really important that we get this.
No, I think that's it. I think, you just touched on it. What I would continue to say is there are so many different representations of what this means for us.
Right.
levels of importance in how we practice this. I just think the most important thing, and the thing that brings synergy between different denominations and practices, is the essence of what this day represents. If we can find down to get there, I think it leads to beautiful.
Yep. And then it ceases to become law and it becomes liberating, which is a beautiful thing. Curtis Zackery, thank you so much. I'll show you the book here. It's Soul Rest. The devotional is Soul Rest. The website's findrest.org. And I will leave you with, even though he told me I didn't have to promote it, curtiszackery.com, because he's also got some writing. I understand you're a bit of a poet, and the podcast and ways to connect, and so I want people to see that. That's right there. So thank you. Thank you for hanging out with us, and make this a priority. I mean, it is one of the 10 Commandments, so obviously God made it a priority, but it's for you to take the day off and let your soul rest in the God who wants to know you. It's not about him laying down some laws that you have to follow so he won't be mad at you. No, it's about a loving Father, and that's the heart of it. So thank you again, Curtis, for reminding us of that, and you guys share this so other people can hear the good news. If you haven't followed or subscribed, I would urge you to do that now. And join us again tomorrow. We'll be here all week with fabulous interviews to let you have some deeper roots so you can have some better fruit. We'll see you next time here on Life Today Live.
Christ says come, the Spirit says come, the church says come. Let him that heareth say come, and let him that is athirst come. They will find no drought in God's ever-flowing and abundant springs of grace.